Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Huge areas of both Syria and Iraq are now under the control of ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The Iraq-Syria border has been effectively dissolved, and there is now intense fighting between ISIS and Kurdish forces in the northeast of Syria, making the Syria-Turkish border unstable as Turkish Kurds come to the aid of Syrian Kurds. In today's programme, we ask how strong are ISIS? And what of the other Syrian opposition groups? Are ISIS overreaching themselves? And will the turmoil in the region eventually lead to the unwinding of the deal that established the modern national borders of the Middle East after the First World War? Well, joining me in the studio to discuss these questions are Professor Bill Bowring, Professor of Law at Birkbeck University of London, Dr. Rebwa Fattah, a Middle East analyst and Director at the Middle East Consultancy Services, and Meher Katem, a doctoral candidate focused on Iraqi civil society at the School of Oriental and African Studies. On the line, we're joined by Colin Freeman, the Chief Foreign Correspondent at the Sunday Telegraph. Welcome to you all, but first let's take a look at this report.
Iraq soldiers in Baghdad were out on force during the Eid holiday. Despite the end of the holy month of Ramadan, the military were taking no chances as they worked to keep ISIS forces away from the city.
A tightened security plan has been worked out to secure people in the streets and give citizens a feeling of safety. God willing, we have intensified patrols, both foot and vehicle patrols, which are carried out by the intelligence section of the 4th Brigade.
Since June, when the extremist Islamic State of Iraq and Syria group stunned the world by taking control of Tikrit and Mosul, the Iraqi army has been on the back foot. With Iraq's caretaker Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki facing calls to make way for someone more able to bridge the sectarian divides, the UN Secretary-General sought advice from the Shiite Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani about how to deal with the situation.
His Eminence, I agree that political leaders must refrain from radical statements and accusations. In this time of crisis, when we see the shocking treatment of minorities by the Islamic State, His Eminence continues to preach peace, love, and unity among all elements of Iraqi society.
But the sectarian and ethnic divides in Iraq between Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish peoples is arguably now too deep for a single Iraqi state to be trusted with securing all of its peoples. In the semi-autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan region, the head of its National Security Council said that this insecurity will be felt everywhere unless swift action is taken.
These are people that are not going to die in battles in Iraq and Syria. Many of these people will go back to their countries of origin, becoming potential leaders or terrorist operatives, which could really become bigger threats to their own countries. I think the U.S. and the international community as a whole should feel responsible, and they have a moral responsibility to come to the assistance of those people that are putting their lives on line to protect civilians.
But over in Syria, the conflict with ISIS is further complicated by the ongoing civil war between the government forces of President Bashar al-Assad and the various rebel groups who oppose him. As the Free Syrian Army has lost ground, the main battle in some parts of the country is now between the government forces and ISIS. On Syrian TV recently, government forces claimed to have retaken a gas field near the city of Homs from ISIS control. ISIS, however, claimed that their fighters pulled out after destroying the field's equipment and capturing at least 15 tanks and dozens of rockets, which were initially used to guard the field. For the Syrian National Coalition, the incursion of ISIS into the Syrian conflict means that their struggle is becoming almost impossible.
We've always told the international community that the policy of containment is a failed policy. ISIS will continue to grow. The FSA, with its very limited weapons, are having to face ISIS, which captured also some weapons from Iraq, continues to have the largest amount of money at their hands, so they continue to grow. Unfortunately, it means that we have to continue to fight this uphill battle. It is really, at this point, the ball is in the international community's court.
With ISIS now proclaiming a new caliphate of Iraq and Syria, the group looks set to further entrench its position across the two countries. But whether rebel or government forces will be effective in repelling the rebels will be much more difficult to determine. Nathaniel Amos Sansom, Islam Channel.
Okay, so in this part of the discussion, let's focus first of all on Iraq. Meher, have ISIS stabilised their position in Iraq? I mean, there was a point when the original ground was taken where everybody was saying, oh, they're going to be in Baghdad. That doesn't seem likely now, but it doesn't seem like they're going away either.
Well, the main priority for ISIS is to consolidate the lands they have at the moment and not to instigate any more problems than they already have. Of course, that means the political economy of the lands they've taken need to be consolidated. Mainly oil needs to be exported from this area so that it can actually function as the type of state they want to see. At the moment, the Iraqi army is in the process of being reformed and reshaped. It's very weak, as we've seen. It's been 7 weeks since ISIS have taken over Mosul, but it seems as if the Iraqi army is still very weak. So those cracks in the Iraqi army, in Iraqi security forces, may actually be an opportunity for ISIS to expand. But at the moment, they're actually trying to consolidate the massive territory they've gained.
So, Dr. Fatah, is there any chance that the Iraqi state will be able to retake the territory that it lost?
Not the current Iraqi government. I don't think there's any chance of the current Iraqi government to retake the land being taken by ISIS, because you like it or not, this was really a Sunni uprising against Shia-dominated state. I understand maybe not all the Sunnis agree with the ISIS policy and ISIS approach to things, but the local insurgency, the former parties like Jaysh al-Rijal al-Naqshbandiya, Jaysh al-Mujahideen, Thawrat al-Ashin, and the rest of them, they will support ISIS. And obviously, this wasn't done overnight. They built for it, and suddenly they took over. I mean, the ISIS number was about like 2,000 or so, but the local people and the local insurgency supported them. I don't believe there's any chance of the current Iraqi government and also the state, the way it's shaped, to have a control, because after 2003, you like it or not, Sunni were marginalized.
So, Bill, does it look as if the Iraqi state is finished? That what we're going to end up with is the existing government or any conceivable government having the south, the Kurds having their own, what is effectively autonomous territory now, and the rest of it either in the hands of ISIS or quite possibly at least in the hands of Sunnis?
I'd say that there has not been a viable Iraqi state at any point, as a matter of fact. So what we have at the present time is the unravelling of the deal between France and Britain after the First World War for carving up the Ottoman Empire, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And Iraq was 3 territories, any case. And Britain, of course, tried to incorporate it into the Indian Empire after the First World War. And what we've seen ever since is the attempt to hold together 3 very different regions, actually 3 countries in reality. So what we've seen here is, I mean, I think it would be wrong to describe it as simply Sunni, but Sunni, secular, and ISIS, as a matter of fact, who are opposed to the present regime in Baghdad. But of course, a reason they didn't take Baghdad is that the Sadr, the Shia militias, the support of Iran, are extremely important. And the southern part of Iraq has been effectively under the control of Iran ever since the war. So here we see the further unravelling of what was never actually viable in the first place.
Well, let me bring Colin Freeman in from the Sunday Telegraph. Colin, do you agree with that? Do you think Iraq is over as a unitary state?
Well, certainly that seems to be the view from both the British and American diplomats that I've spoken to while I was out in Baghdad last month, shortly after the ISIS uprising. They're normally quite optimistic or about the Iraq project, as it were, if you like, always saying that things will pull through. On this occasion, when we met diplomats, there was a markedly different tone. They were much more pessimistic. They were saying, look, the future of this country is at stake, and if things go on as they are, then, the country may well break up. And to echo what one of your previous speakers was saying, They were certainly very pessimistic about the prospects of the Iraqi army being able to regain places like Mosul in the north, major urban conurbations, which, would have challenged the Americans with their much superior firepower, etc., were they to try and attempt to retake the city in the same fashion. You have to remember that ISIS, while there may not be that many of them, they do have the backing of some local people, if not all of them, and also these people are, they're world-class insurgents. If the Iraqi army comes in, it will get cut to pieces with booby traps, roadside bombs, all kinds of other things when it starts trying to retake their turf. So certainly there does seem to be, there is talk of this, this kind of Sunni state, Sunni Stan, whatever you might want to call it, as a sort of journalistic shorthand, that is going to emerge as a sort of de facto breakaway state. Now, it's clearly not going to be a terribly viable state in terms of, it's not going to get international recognition from anywhere. It's going to be a pretty hellish place for many Iraqis to live, especially the minorities who are, pockets of which exist there, Shias, Kurds, Christians, and so on. But, as things stand, it's hard to see that sort of that breakaway state not at least having a few years to go before it either implodes or the rest of the world decides to do something about it.
So, Colin,
I can't see the latter happening, really.
So, Colin, well, that brings me to my second question, really. I mean, diplomats are paid to have a plan B. Do they have one?
Didn't sound like it from what I was told, but it is the short, blunt, and I think probably the most honest answer.
Okay. Mahir, do you think that's true, that basically, I mean, what we're saying really is that the consequence of the Iraq war is the destruction of the country and that the Western powers don't have a viable foreign policy towards it?
Well, they've never really had a viable policy, even since the 1990s. I mean, the Kurdish state was actually established in the 1990s after the Gulf War. But I think we need to read maybe slightly Michel Foucault and understand how governments are formed. And actually, borders are not so important as much as the role of rule and governing is very important and undergirded by material resources. And that's collapsed in Iraq. It's not the borders that have collapsed, but it's actually the governing systems.
Hang on a minute. I mean, with all due respect to Foucault, you were talking about the need to sell the oil. You've got to be a functioning state to do that.
There's no doubt about that. And this is part of the problem because the Kurds themselves are actually selling oil independently of Baghdad. The ISIS is trying to mimic the same, reproduce the same type of system so they can produce their own state. ISIS is a terrorist group, and the idea and the practice of the Iraqi state, don't forget, this is a $130 billion state in terms of the oil mostly sold via Basra. So this is very important, and that this is actually a gravitational pull towards Baghdad, so that all the Kurds, the Sunni groups, and of course we speak about these Kurds and Sunni groups and the Shia as if they were monolithic whole groups, but actually there are many in between. And of course we have a political process in Baghdad where many of these groups are involved. Maliki was actually in Sulaymaniyah recently with Talabani. I mean, there's politics being played here. But from my experience, I mean, the same language was actually used in 2006 and 2007, and then you had an American surge which pumped billions of dollars into the grassroots in Iraq and actually helped save Iraq from collapse. That can happen again, and Maliki, unfortunately, did not carry on with the Sahwa, the policies that were established with the awakening councils.
So, Dr. Fatah, just to move that discussion on a bit, I mean, the Kurds have a kind of historic movement, more or less united. They have a kind of cultural affinity. You can see how a kind of functioning state might emerge out of the Kurdish movement. It's always been its aim. Hard to see ISIS doing the same thing. I mean, it's very different in nature, isn't it?
It's very different in nature, but I think maybe we should ask what. I think sometimes conspiracy theory is useful. What's the aim of ISIS movement, if it's a movement? Is it really to break this so-called Shia crescent that moves between, I don't know, from Iran to Iraq to Syria and to Hezbollah? If the aim was to destroy that, it was very effective. But maybe that's the first part. Once they are now in power, they are in power now, they're running, They have running cities, they run in towns, and they have the functioning council and so on. I think this is where it becomes difficult. As long as they keep fighting, I think they will be okay. But once they start trying to run, because the other groups, they don't agree with ISIS. For example, the former Ba'athis, Rijal al-Naqshbandiya, they totally, they are secular people, they disagree with ISIS. So if they try to rule together, I think they will be fighting. And we have already seen fights between them.
Do you think what will happen is not that the Iraqi army will drive ISIS out, but that their allies, who are more powerful than socially, have greater weight than they do, will eventually drive them out?
I don't think there's a question. Actually, I mean, let's see. I think it would be foolish to make predictions, but quite clearly the Iraqi government's not going to do it, nor the Iraqi army, for the reasons that have been expressed. Clearly there is a very strong Shia counter movement, but it would be surprising if that was actually strong enough to drive them out. And the thing is that, demand for oil is such, I strongly suspect that oil will get sold one way or another, whoever is in power in the region, actually, and they will find ways of getting it out. Where I totally agree with my colleague is that this is a very unstable coalition, and the ISIS is really a brand, it's a rather effective brand, with their flag and so on, but it's not many people at all. And they've done so well precisely because of the Baathists and secularists and people and Sunnis. I mean, but completely wrong to call it a Sunni movement or a Sunni attempt to say it's not that at all. So I think but of course the rest of Iraq, apart from Kurdistan, is unstable too. That's why I think there's such a focus on Kurdistan, which has really turned into a very viable, and has actually, as a result of what's been happening, declared itself as a state increasingly.
Colin, what do the diplomats say? Are they thinking that that if we can't get the Iraqi army to a state where they can deal with this, that the other parts of the alliance that came together against the Maliki government will fall apart when they try to govern, as Dr. Fattah was suggesting?
I don't think they're terribly optimistic about the chances of getting the other allies to unite. One thing they talked about was trying to get Mr. Maliki, who after all is still the only politician who got a substantial popular vote, personal popular vote, in the last elections earlier this year, about 1 million votes. They're trying to find a way of fusing that with maybe some sort of concessionary gestures that could bring in some of the Sunni politicians, the more moderate Sunni politicians, who could in turn peel away some of the popular sort of pockets of Sunni support for ISIS. But that's quite a difficult task, and they left us in no doubt, most of the diplomats, that they weren't really sure whether the Iraqi political class, as it were, was particularly up to the job. They hadn't really demonstrated a great deal of urgency in doing things even after the ISIS sort of wake up call. And as many people have read, large numbers of the Iraqi parliament have already left and fled abroad. It's not the actions really of a government that is terribly serious, and also just amongst politicians, amongst the view of Iraqis of the political class at large is generally pretty contemptuous. It's not just about Sunni, Shia, or whatever. A lot of Iraqis, be they Sunni, Shia, or Sunni, just don't like the political class at all. So the notion that the politicians hold the key to all this is perhaps a little bit exaggerated anyway.
Okay, well, let me just put that
beyond that level.
Do you think that's true, Mahir? Is the political class so I mean, it wouldn't be a surprising outcome of 10 years or more of war and occupation that the political class was bankrupt.
Yeah, I agree. You have to look at the system that's been in place for the past 10 years. It's a sectarian system. People have climbed on this sectarian system based on their own ethno-nationalist identity and sectarian identities, and not on merit. And therefore, the Iraqis who have potential to be statesmen, are actually relegated to a lesser role in Iraq today, rather than those who actually can play this type of politics. Just one very important point. It seems as if there's an emerging consensus. I mean, you speak about the political leadership. There's an emerging consensus regarding Maliki, and it seems as if the Shia clergy and also the coalition he's part of are pressuring him to go. And of course, I mean, he's lost a lot of credibility in Iraq, even if he's had a significant amount of the previous parliamentary vote. But he needs to go, and there's a consensus regarding that. So there is sort of an engagement with the political leadership, but it's because it's been captured by sort of certain individuals, and those need to go. And I think in the future, the Kurds will be, and particularly because they're key players in Iraq, will be happy to work with the next leader in Iraq. And I think there's a future in that.
Dr. Fadl, do you think that's true, that the kind of the change that might work would be a kind of reformulation of the government? I mean, you were suggesting that perhaps, or perhaps there's something deeper, as we've also been discussing, in the whole functioning of the state, which is amiss here.
Well, I mean, I think Professor mentioned that the Iraqi state never really worked. It has never been a viable state. And the problem is, okay, Maliki has about a million votes, but he received those votes just in the Shia region, not anywhere else. And actually, the election itself in Iraq reassures us that the country is divided. There is no a single Iraqi national party or organization that can take part in the election, and everybody from Kurds, from Sunni, from Shia, from Christian vote for that part. I mean, the last one I remember was the Iraqi Communist Party, but of course that disappeared. So, and all the political groups now are along the lines of ethno-religious groups. Even Turkomans have their own, and even Christians got their own. So it will be very difficult to build Iraq the way we used to think. Anyone gets majority will have formed the government. It does not work.
I'm going to have to stop you there, because that's all we've got time for in the first part of the programme. But do join us after the break, when we'll be considering what's happening with ISIS over the border, or where the border used to be, in Syria.